Good evening and welcome to another art stream with myself, Pharaoh, and my two co-hosts, Alexander Adams and Panama Hat. How are we doing this evening, gentlemen?
Diversity is our strength, comrades.
We have nothing to lose but our chains, and I love the nation of Israel.
Yes, and with our formal greetings finished, how are we both doing this evening?
Doing fine. We enjoyed our Nomos event in Birmingham, where we both spoke alongside colleagues.
So this was 2 weeks ago now, was it?
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. And then what was remind us, what were your talks on, and can you give us a little cheeky synopsis maybe, Alex, if you want to go first?
Mine was on the role of the avant-garde in the arts, and basically just saying we shouldn't just think of it in terms of artists working alone, but rather situations that tend to thrust artists to the forefront in the vanguard involuntarily. We should also consider the role of organizations such as bars or cinemas or venues, and also studio buildings in fostering links between members of the avant-garde.
Interesting. So again, those kind of acting as like nodes.
Yeah.
Didn't like all the Frenchies sort of like hang around like one or two cafes or whatever. That's the classic.
Yeah, and my example was La Ruche and Bartholomew, which were two disused factories which were used as studios, and they had these concentration of modernist artists who created basically almost the entire modernist movement. And regardless of what you think of the modernist movement, there's no denying that it was extremely successful and that it certainly pushed forward their ideas. So it was extremely successful in that sense.
There's something interesting there about the importance of space for artists, both in terms of like I guess kind of formal education spaces for artists, and then like you said, these kind of disused spaces, which do seem to be an important space for artists to be in. In my opinion, none of those three exist for the modern artist.
Especially not the likes of us.
Yeah, well, exactly. Like, if, for example, there's a new upcoming artist and he wanted to put on a show, where could you do that in central London? All of the disused factory spaces have already been turned into flats.
People will remember that the Frieze exhibition, which broke the young British artists and introduced them to Saatchi, who became their principal funder of the first sort of wave. That was held in a disused building in Docklands, and Docklands at the time was being redeveloped. This was just as Canary Wharf was being built, so this was right at the early stage, and they managed to get hold of an empty warehouse building and fill it full of art, and they sort of paid for taxis for art critics to go over and see it, and it was a great success, and they actually did it themselves in their own empty space. I think a lot of opportunities like that are no longer open. I think a lot of the sort of the innovative spirit and sort of intensity and seriousness has gone from a lot of artists. So they wouldn't actually attempt that now, which I think is regrettable.
I mean, isn't it kind of in vogue among artists now, basically not to stand for anything? You don't really have unless it's something paused, I suppose.
No, yeah. I think there's a lot of political art.
But there's also street art, and I mean, I don't like it, and I personally don't care for it. But you could say that, well, street art, although it's been relatively tamed in the last sort of 10 years or so, it was initially a way of getting yourself a gallery, getting a canvas by simply turning the walls of a building into a canvas.
Yeah, and I guess interestingly, probably digital is the only space available. And I've seen a number of artists talk about trying to create digital spaces for their works, but it's hard, especially if you're a physical artist.
Definitely.
There
was at this event though, there's a chap who I think you'll remember from the last time. I don't think I'm not going to name him, but I don't think he would mind if I described him as flamboyant, shall we say?
Oh yes, yeah.
And he was very keen on what Alexander was saying, and he basically said, if I opened like a right wing like artist nightclub like in the south somewhere. Would you all be interested in coming? So yeah,
I got to say that I would not travel the river to go to his artist nightclub. If it was North London, I would consider it, but
what is this?
I'm a South London boy, or I was when I was living there.
Listen to these two.
No, I actually grew up.
I was a goldsmith's degenerate, you see.
Yeah, I grew up in South London, but quickly moved, and my roguish past was left behind me. But
Gulad.
Enough about that. Hat, what was your talk on? And
it was on the intellectual vanguard, where I basically said that in order for people like us to achieve power, eventually, which surely is the end goal, we have to create a kind of very close-knit intellectual vanguard. I compared it to like how it doesn't matter if you have the strongest limbs in the world, you have to have a brain that tells those limbs what to do, basically. So, and although it sounds a bit suspect, I used the example of Lenin in Russia, who basically took over the communist organization there and turned it into what it was originally, this kind of mass populist kind of broad action party that was more or less achieving nothing. And he basically took it and turned it into this very, very tight-knit, highly organized movement of basically intellectuals and people that were very closely connected with each other and could kind of put their personal nuances aside to put together a kind of common front, which could then, that became powerful enough that it could kind of direct various other organizations. It could then build itself up a base of power. And I basically said that, look, if we're going to get anywhere, that's what we need. We need this highly organized vanguard that's ready to do whatever it needs, basically. Because that's how you triumph over forces far more powerful than you are.
And I think that's really interesting because, again, when you look at the history of artists, they have a tendency to sort of naturally coalesce together. Like Mercury, which has been knocked apart. There's that kind of force which draws artistic and intellectual people together. But I wonder whether a lot of the systems are in place now. I think Bap was mentioning it on his latest podcast around how people, like, we're sort of post meritocracy now. It's just like we're not even choosing people because they're supposedly good at something. It's just choosing literally anyone, or choosing like the worst kinds of people. So that natural coalescence of great minds or artistically minded people just can't happen anymore with the existing structures. So but I haven't necessarily got a solution to that. It's just a challenge for the future and some more thought. But I think in the meantime we can do things tonight, reminiscing on ages past and think of the future. So before we get into the work tonight, I wanted to have a bit of space for Alexander Adams to talk about the Ukrainian dancers, because Mr. D in the AA's last UO had quite a long section talking about this work. So I don't know if you want to give a bit of an introduction about it, Alex, and then talk about your viewpoints on the work.
Yes. So basically, the the issue was there's a series of pastel drawings created around sort of 1900 or so, or slightly after, by Degas, the French Impressionist painter. And these drawings have traditionally been known as the Russian dancers, and they feature. Now you'll know Degas from his ballet paintings. So ballerinas are wearing sort of traditional French classical ballet garb, with the tutus and the stockings and so forth, and tight bodices and so forth. The Russian dancers is a series quite late in Degas' life, when his eyesight was going and he had to draw in quite a rough manner with very strong colours. And these were drawings based on a troupe of apparently Russian dancers who went through Paris at around sort of 1900 or so, and were famous for doing their own particular dance. They wore their own their own style clothing. So this was sort of heavy boots, long dresses, white blouses. So this was folk dancing, not sort of high culture dancing. Wasn't sort of cultivated dancing, as it were. And so Degas produced this series of drawings and paintings, and they've been distributed in museums throughout the world. And recently, the National Gallery has retitled its. This is the National Gallery in London has retitled its drawing, pastel painting, the Russian dancers to the Ukrainian dancers. So, and Mr. D was, of course, most unhappy about this. He was saying, this was sort of National Gallery curators sort of following politics and sort of meddling in art history for the sake of woke virtue points. And to that extent, I don't disagree with him. I think he's actually correct. I think that's exactly why it was done. However, as the author of the forthcoming book, Degas, published by Pastels in April 2022, I can tell you that there was actually some research on this before the Ukrainian-Russian war. And I'll read you out a couple of paragraphs, very brief paragraphs from this forthcoming book. So here you have an exclusive. Commonly described as Russian, the costumes of these dancers have recently been identified as Ukrainian. The flowers are also typical of Ukrainian, not Russian, national folk costume. These Ukrainians must have resigned themselves to being misidentified due to general ignorance about their nation. The heaviness and looseness of the clothing is the polar opposite of the minimal specialized costumes of French ballet. So what happened was that Ukrainian dancers were generally just referred to as Russian dancers, in the same way that I think ambassadors from Indochina were often referred to as Thai and so forth, that they were just sort of referred to by the nearest large continent or nearest large country that people had heard of. So these these were probably genuinely Ukrainians, but when they toured, they probably advertised themselves as Russian and were described as Russian.
Yeah, I think there's a few interesting things here for me, because firstly, it asks the question around the naming of artworks. Should it be the preserve of the artist? Should it be the preserve of museums? And I think this just sets like a terrible precedent about art, like the naming of artworks. Why don't we just like change any artwork's name? For example, maybe it's who's like Colston, for example. Maybe there's like a portrait of Colston. I'm going to change the portrait's name to a portrait of the slave-owning racist Colston. And what you're opening this door of change. Things that are set in stone should be left alone. And the second thing I've got to say, Alex, did Ukraine as a nation exist at that time? The answer is no. Therefore, it's a terrible.
It was part of the Russian. It was part of the Russian Empire, I believe.
Exactly. Yeah. Didn't exist. Therefore, it's obvious.
It speaks to something very depressing about the time we live in. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that to the people that run these institutions, art has no temporal meaning beyond political fashion. Basically, it doesn't. They don't seem to actually care about art in any metaphysical way. They just want to be relevant. Like it's rather sad, isn't it?
Yes, well, yes, absolutely. I do think that they are completely driven by the ones who are at the upper reaches of art historical organizations at the moment are largely driven, are often political appointees and are driven by politics. The idea about the titles is somewhat more unclear, because often artists in the 19th century very often didn't title works. So and especially earlier than the 19th century, they didn't title work. So it was just sort of, a head of Medusa, a Madonna and Child, a view of the Campagna. So often they had informal titles which slowly became written down and became conventionalized, just simply through, to stop people referring to the same picture by different names, just to simplify things. So often artists didn't give titles to works. The titling of works often came out along with the salon. So when you submitted a work, of course, you had to entitle it for the salon. So this would be listed in the salon catalogue. And then that's how a lot of pictures got their names, got their official names. As for Degas, I don't think he generally didn't title his works, although I believe he generally referred to this group of pictures as the Russian dancers. So he did think of them as Russians.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting what you basically described there was the foundation of tradition, though, isn't it? It's kind of like the informal turned formal. The ritualization of stuff chosen over time. That's why I find the whole thing quite egregious. But interesting point, and certainly worthy pointing out the context of that as well. But something for people to consider. Leave a comment with your thoughts if you think it's Ukrainian or Russian. Okay, on to the matter at hand tonight. So last time we looked through art of the First World War. This was Panama's suggestion, and again, throwing this over to you, Panama. What was the kind of concept behind this series?
So we originally had an idea about the kind of looking at how modernism became the mainstream of art. How did the modernists, who basically started out with no credibility in any institution, rather like some of us now, how did they gain institutional power and then go on to become the kind of the powerhouses of art? How did they become what we know as of art in the last 100 years and also partly today? And then we got around to thinking about the First World War as well, because that basically seems to be a kind of crossover point at which basically the kind of avant-garde pre-war is still kind of out. They're still kind of outsiders, and then as the war progresses, and then by the time it's over, they seem to be very, very mainstream. And my personal idea around this, as I elucidated last week, is that the experiences that men underwent during the war kind of called for something almost. It did call, I think, for a new form of depiction in art, or a new way of doing it, at least, to sort of get across to a wider audience what that felt like. I think that the experiences of World War I were so detached from a lot of experiences, especially martial experiences prior to that, that it kind of spurred that on. At least it helped a lot of the modernists. And I think as we talked about, quite a lot of them actually went to the war, and they experienced the war themselves. They didn't sit it out unless they were too old. We talked about Wyndham Lewis, didn't we? One that we didn't mention, but I know who did go to the war, was Jacob Epstein as well.
Yes.
And various others as well. They were very keyed into this experience, and I think I said,
he's also his ally and friend Gaudiya Brezka also went to the war and died on the front, I believe.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I think we're going to kind of kickstart with one of Alexander's picks. So let me just share my screen a second.
Yes, I have to warn people that these images are slightly grim, so there's going to be no gore.
Yes.
This is not very pleasant. Yeah.
I will say now, some of the Otto Dix paintings, if we make it to them, are very graphic.
So this is Sir Henry. I think it was later Sir Henry Tonks, who was
hell of a name, isn't it? Henry Tonks.
Yeah, so he was a senior. He's better known as a teacher. He used to work for the Royal College of Surgeons, and he also did he was also an art teacher as well. At
the Slade, I believe. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm just looking up him now. Yes, he's at the Slade and Westminster School of Art. So he was a relatively traditional artist. So he was a relatively traditional artist. He was best known for his teaching. He was also working for the Royal College of Surgeons. This is him in his dress uniform. He served. So he served during the First World War as a medical orderly. And as such, he was sort of seeing wounded soldiers coming in very frequently. He became a war artist at the end. The war artist program was only initiated in sort of like 1917 or something. So you'll remember that with Wyndham Lewis, he became a war artist just for the last year or so of the war. Mm-hmm. So if you want to go on to the first, so these are him. This is him with some of his work. And he specialised in doing these drawings of injured servicemen, often very seriously injured, especially with facial or head injuries. This was for two reasons. I think one of this was sort of to allow to illustrate lectures so that surgeons could talk about what sort of injuries they had dealt with and what sort of injuries people could, surgeons would be facing. I think this is like at the end of the war, or sort of obviously in preparation for any future conflict. And the other reason was it was to do with recording and sort of advancing or proposing various courses for cosmetic reconstruction. Now, obviously, these were extremely graphic and serious injuries, so there was often a lot that you couldn't do. But there were various things that you could do with sort of prosthetics. You couldn't do much in terms of technical plastic surgery, but you could do something with prosthetics and with a little bit of sometimes with a little bit of makeup or something. But obviously some of these injuries are so catastrophic that there's really not much you could do about them.
In terms of the kind of work itself, is this in like is it in pastels or?
Yeah, these were in pastels. I think most of his were. I think this was mainly. It was supposed to be quite quick, so he could work quite quickly. Also, he could be relatively realistic in terms of colouring. So if you're doing just like an ink wash or something, then that's obviously you're not getting any colour. But with the lividity of wounds and so forth, it's good to have colour so that you can actually show this to surgeons and say, look, you'll find that there'll be a great deal of lividity or lack of lividity in certain areas due to disruptions.
Should we go to the next one?
Yeah. Yes. So these are some of the wounds that surgeons were seeing, and often finding that there was very little that they could do about them. Also, I think that this is sort of important when you think about sort of the images that a lot of people will know the images of Dix and Gross from the German side, and of course they're quite famous for showing cripples with massive deformities and so forth. These are slightly more realistic images, but this is the sort of thing that you would actually have seen in the streets quite commonly in the 1920s and 30s.
Yes. It's also worth just mentioning as well, I think, that the sheer scale that this happened on was unprecedented. I mean, obviously the famous book by Junger is in English, Storm of Steel. I mean, that's literally what it was. And of course there was an element to which, if you rewind, not even that long ago, let's say the American Civil War, as long as you weren't actually in battle with the enemy, you were basically fine. You weren't in any real harm. Whereas in this war, of course, no matter where you were, you'd be in the trenches and you'd be in the range of enemy guns. At any minute, shells or shrapnel or gas or anything could come raining down on you. and
kill
you
within a range of miles. So there really wasn't, the front line was an extremely broad area.
Yeah, you were always under a threat. There was always, and anything could come and kill you or maim you horribly, as you see here. And this is part of, I think, the reason why the art is so sort of stark, and there's a minimalism to it. I mean, as you say, he would have showed these to students, and there isn't any kind of background or really much detail to the figure itself. It's just kind of the focus is entirely on this kind of gaping mouth wound, cheek wound.
And just kind of going back to kind of the medium itself. I mean, I've never worked with the pastels. I'm sure Alexander, you can talk to it a little bit more. But from my understanding, there's a lot more kind of blending techniques, layering that you can do. It's very fast to apply, but you can again create these kind of quite beautiful areas of gradients, etc., relatively easily. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yeah. So you can, technically it's quite a versatile medium. You can work over it quite quickly, so that has an advantage over especially oil paint. Oil paint, you would either have to scrape down and wipe something dry if you'd made a mistake or you wanted to add something onto it, or you would have to allow it to dry, which would take sort of a couple of days at least. So when you're working with pastel, you're quite able to blend things quite quickly. You can apply new pigment over the old pigment. There's no problem of it necessarily blending, because you don't have to blend it, so you can actually just draw over the top. It's also extremely portable, so you can have just like a little case filled with sort of 20 or 30 different pastels, and you can blend as well, so you've got more colors than those 30, and it's very easy to get quite rich color effects, to work extremely fast and to be quite mobile. So if you're actually working in the field, I believe some of these were done in the field, some of these were done back in London or in various British hospitals.
Yeah, because again, just if you just look at the kind of typical makeup of these, stuff like the hair has been reduced to literally like a couple of strokes. There's a kind of a real roughness to it. With the ear, you can see probably like the kind of outlining effect that you'd start off with, just drawing a rough outline, blocking out the shapes. But then all of the focus is interestingly like on the cheeks, nose, eyes, and neck, and that's obviously because that's where the injuries are. But you can just see, I think that the nose is particularly lovely here. Some really nice shading.
You do get a sense of these people as individuals, and I think that when you look at these, it's extremely sobering to consider that these were extremely young men, sometimes not much over 20, and they would be left with these catastrophic injuries for the next 60 years of their life.
Some of them weren't even that old. Some of them were like 16, 17, if that. The
last thing I'll say, sorry, before moving on, is again just the kind of color scheme, because there's just so many reds in here. So, for example, you've got like a Van Dyke brown, quite like a dark brown, but maybe like a burnt sienna, which is kind of like a much more reddy brown. But again, all of the browns have red notes. Then it's kind of like the blood red, which then goes into the lips as well. I think is interesting. Again, lips typically, like unless it's a voluptuous maiden, do not have lips as red as that. But he's he's kept it. So you end up with this kind of quite dark, quite brown and almost like Dutch Renaissance kind of style, but it's got that kind of earthiness of a man who's been pulled out of the trenches at the same time. So
yes, just to mention, we should probably discuss this at the end rather than interrupt the Tonks here. But somebody in the chat has asked, why does it seem that there were more prominent artists and writers who gained prominence because of their work responding to the brutality of World War I compared to World War II?
I think because the modernist movement was sort of in full spate in the 1910s, and also you could see it as a decisive break from symbolism and Edwardian art and the sort of the hangover of Victorian artists, because a lot of Victorian artists were still working in the 1910s. They hadn't all died off in 1900 or 1901. So this is seen as a decisive break, and that's why I think that's why people talk about visual artists in such important as being so important during this period. Also, you've got to remember that also you had a great outgrowth of great poetry, especially in British poetry at this time. Whereas you just don't see the same corresponding flourishing of new forms and groundbreaking forms and prominent artists and poets in the Second World War. For whatever reason, I think it's to do with a change in epoch.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be a little bit more base here, and I'm just going to be going to repeat. Was it the famous line to the Americans? I'm sorry, but we're broke. By the Second World War, we're basically a bankrupt nation, while in the 1900s we're the richest nation in the world per capita, and that combined with, you can say what you like about them. The Victorians were an aesthetic generation or period, and they produced a ton of art colleges. Art was valued in multiple different ways. So you've got an elite class that wants art, that values it and can afford it. And then I think, like Alex said, you have got the modernists appearing, but like you said, you've got the old guard. So there's a literal war for art going on at the same time, with great minds from both sides fighting it out.
Also, I would also mention that in the 1940s, the rising tide was in abstract art. So obviously that didn't really fit onto war art. So you couldn't honestly pay an abstract artist to be your war artist, because they would come back with abstract art, and even if you might like it as art, it would not be very good as documentation. So you couldn't really do that. So a lot of the best artists of the 1940s were abstract or semi-abstract, and so therefore they were not commissioned as war artists.
Yeah, but I think it's a great question. But I think it's
a big subject.
Yeah, we're broken. Also, I think the confidence of the nation was shattered as well.
Yes.
If you see there's the kind of zeal and patriotism that the average squaddie had compared to the beginning of the Second World War, it's like a world away.
Yeah.
It's anyway. Maybe we should discuss it another time, because I think it is a big thing which requires a bit more
certainly
specific effort in. But yeah, any thoughts, Hat, before we move on?
I definitely agree with you that the government comparatively blundered into World War II, and the when you say we were bankrupt, we were really we were bankrupt in so many ways. It wasn't just the money; it was also a kind of cultural death. And I think that the kind of cultural malaise that would come after the war really started in some ways prior to it. I think that there was a kind of there wasn't the same kind of optimism in general that there was after the First World War than there was prior to it. And like, for example, you look at how the Vorticist group and all those sorts of aligned people presented themselves prior to the First World War, and then how they presented themselves afterwards. It was kind of like all of a sudden they'd crossed this threshold into adulthood. There was a sense that they weren't really playing around anymore. And of course, then you have T.S. Eliot with his very famous poems on basically that now it's all dead. Now there's nothing left. Everything's been drained of life. The wasteland, the hollow men. This kind of aging of a great civilization into its Kali Yuga, to use the Evolian term. I think that was just a general feeling that set in, and I think that's a big part of the answer to that question.
Okay, back to Tonks. Shall we move on to the next image?
Yeah. So not much to say about these individual images other than I would say, to people who have lately got the war fever, I would say look at these images and consider about your advocacy for joining a war or extending a war or encouraging other people to fight a war if you're not prepared to put yourself on the line of fire and end up with injuries like this.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing is never encourage others to go to war if you wouldn't go yourself.
Should we just skip through these? It's very very harrowing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's disturbing, isn't it? I mean, this. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it's just amazing that the surgeons were able to keep this guy together. He's obviously literally took a bullet straight to the middle of his face.
Something's gone through his head.
Yeah. And they've managed to reconstruct it. Like I saw this big documentary about how they would recreate the noses by taking, sorry to be gross, like skin flaps from other parts of the body and then wrapping it round. And because the skin flaps were still connected to
the capillaries.
The capillaries, etc. It didn't die off, basically, and it just looks so much better to have this kind of flap of a nose than it did to have like the hole. I didn't ever seen a man without a nose.
Yeah, it's really horrifying.
But it's so funny. Such a small triangle of flesh makes such a difference to your face. I think.
And this accelerated a lot of prosthetics and so forth. Because you had such a huge number of people in need of these these interventions. So various plates, things made out of papier-mâché and plaster and so forth. There were all sorts of devices that were sort of concocted to try and ameliorate these severe injuries. And although obviously you've got people like this who did survive, and you think, well, this is amazing, but you can think of a lot of. He must have been one amongst 100 who got injuries as severe as this and survived. The other 99 died.
Yeah.
So although it's amazing that he survived, there were lots of people comparatively injured in a comparative way who did not even live as long as this.
Speaking of that, I've got not of the death, but of the the prosthetics and the technology. I don't know if this is true, but my grandfather was a GP. And I'd got into a quite serious fight with my brother with some sticks, and he'd slashed my face quite badly open, and grandfather quite dramatically knocked everything off. he knocked everything off the table, placed me on the table like it was like some kind of surgeon's bench, and then super glued my face together. And then he said super glue was developed in the first or the First World or the Second World War to help.
I think it was
to help with exactly this kind of thing. So it's
This is a good tip. If you're like hiking with somebody or something and they have like a serious wound, you can just like super glue it shut. If in absence of anything else, it does work. That's a great bit of a deep lore there. Paris childhood. The time that he got a slash on the face and his grandfather like yanked him onto a table.
It was
glued his face shut.
Yeah,
I can imagine.
Yeah, I was just.
Did everything go crashing to the floor when he swept the table clear?
Wow. It was a brilliant moment. I was just literally just shocked by the whole thing. Mind you, I lost about a pint of blood, I'd say, by that time. So
war stories with Pharaoh.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
And so here we have a catastrophic injury. So basically, the whole of the bottom of the jaw is gone.
I mean, this is interesting because this is the first black person we've had so far depicted. # diversity. We are a very diverse show here. But I'm glad we're representing.
Is this a French colonial trooper or?
It might have been, or it might have been sort of a West Indian soldier. I'm not sure exactly.
What about the Doughboys?
Possibly, yeah.
Harlem Hellfighters.
No, it's because I don't think I've seen that many depictions. I guess as a percentage, it would be relatively small, wouldn't it?
Yes, yeah.
But okay, interesting that it was kind of picked up. Tonks will now be celebrated as a champion.
As a champion of diversity.
Champion of diversity.
Of Bane.
Strangely enough, that's how museum curators view these things now.
Exactly.
Really is.
Yeah. I guarantee we'll see like the National Army Museum will put on a big spread for him and then put this right at the centre.
Yes.
Prediction.
They'll make sure that this is the advertisement on the poster for the exhibition. I've noticed that happens a lot. They'll do an exhibition at like the RA, and they'll find like the one depiction of like a sort of like, I don't know, African prince from the 1600s, and they'll make sure that is the poster.
By the way, yes, expect more wonderful diversity, comrades, at the National Gallery this autumn, where there is going to be a big exhibition of Winslow Homer, the late 19th century American painter, celebrated painter of New England. He will be marked in an exhibition which will focus on his links or his depiction of the Caribbean rum trade and the legacy of slavery.
Wow.
Hashtag brave. Hashtag
stunning and brave.
Yeah.
I'm literally shaking right now.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to one of my guys, and we're going to talk about William Offen. How do I pronunciate his name? I'm sure.
Pronunciate.
I keep saying this wrong. Pronounce. There you go. Orphan. Orphan. Sorry, I keep saying that with the H in. Sorry. But just a little bit of an introduction to him. He is an Irishman in England. Now, I thought I'd throw this to you, Hat, as our resident First World War historian. What's the context of Ireland at this time? Because I'm pretty sure that the Home Rule debate was like the big question, wasn't it?
So, prior to the First World War, this is necessary to give a bit of background here, but I'll try and make it quick. So, at the time of the First World War, you had a government which was run by the Liberal Party under Asquith and Lloyd George and Winston Churchill and some others. And their policy was they were pro Home Rule for Ireland. They wanted to give Ireland a parliament, whether or not it would be fully independent or it would become a kind of Australia-style dominion was still up for debate. They weren't really too bothered about that. But the point was they wanted to give Ireland Home Rule, while the Tories were obviously, they were known as the Unionists at the time because they wanted to preserve the Union and they did not want to give Ireland independence. The presumption at the time, there was a very kind of nihilistic idea that no matter what happened with Ireland, there would be a gruesome civil war. Because, of course, the Liberals wanted to give Ireland independence, as I said, but of course, the Ulster counties in the north would resist Home Rule by force of arms. And this was a point at which it's probably the last base thing the Tories ever did. They shipped 200,000 rifles to Northern Ireland while they were in the opposition to fund the pro-union rebels. That was known as the Larne gun running, I believe. Yes, so it's kind of a curious situation because tension is building and building, and it's Ireland is looking like it's going to collapse into war. And there's a mutiny in the army in 1912 where British officers refused to fire on pro Ulster militias and all this. And then the First World War happens, and now the British Empire is at war with Germany, and the kind of mass patriotism and kind of lust to join the war occurred in Ireland too. Lots of young men in Ireland signed up, and they kind of temporarily forgot about the whole situation there. Many Irish went. I think a lot of young Irishmen went to kind of demonstrate themselves, if you see what I mean. They kind of went to prove that they could tough it out. They could make the right choice, and which side of the war. But there was also a faction of Ireland that was using the war for its own ends. Many of the people that would go on to become the leaders of post-war independent Ireland, especially De Valera, were basically pro-German, and they wanted to use the war as a chance to break away. And of course, the famous Easter Rising happened in 1916, when the Irish Republican Army took over Dublin and declared a republic, and it was brutally put down by British Army units in Ireland. Obviously, most people will have heard about that. And then kind of after the war, most of the Irish troops went home. And then the situation got worse, and they ended up either fighting generally on the side of the pro or anti-treaty forces in the Irish Civil War. Most of the Ulstermen went back to become the Black and Tans, the famous Black and Tans, which they were called because they would wear one piece of clothing from the army uniform, that's the tan, and one from the police uniform, which is the black. So yeah, that's the situation in Ireland in the First World War, basically.
And in terms of kind of just general popularity, it was typically like, I guess, the kind of traditional aristocratic class in Ireland were pro-union, and it's kind of like the intellectuals, some artists, I guess, kind of like the more avant-garde, and some poets were kind of pro-independence, weren't they? Pro home rule. So.
It's a lot more complex of a split than modern Irish nationalism likes to portray. There were all over the place. There were various loyalties. It was not always as simple as what religion you were, or where you came from, or what class you were. For example, one of the big ironies is that the only real hotbed of unionism outside the North was Dublin. It was known as a massively unionist area. And I think people in the chat will probably know the song "Come Out Ye Black and Tans," which is basically it's actually about a family of pro-independence people living in a street in Dublin, which is entirely pro-union around them. So it's a very complicated situation. But as I say, when the war breaks out, the political class kind of jumps for joy a little bit, because it temporarily just alleviates that situation, because now everybody is going off to fight the Germans. They're for a minute they're not trying to fight each other and start a civil war.
Well, that's a good segue into the life of Orpen, because he is a Dubliner, but someone I think who had a long love with Britain and Empire and England. He was talented artist from an early age. His family were artists and poets, and he traded in Slade. And actually, Tonks was one of his teacher. That's how I knew that he was training in the Slade school. He ran his own teaching school for a while, but when the First World War broke out, many Irish went back to many Irish in England moved back to Ireland to avoid to avoid the war, but he embraced it. And actually, he wasn't on the original list of war artists, but used his connections from society portraiture to wrangle his way. He sort of blagged it. The kind of impression I get of Orpen is this kind of like slightly narcissistic, slightly Jack of the Lad, but an intensely serious artist at the same time. And so he sort of flung himself in, managed to get a commission, and then through some of his works gained national notoriety. Now, one thing you should know about him is that he here's an example of some of his earlier work. I mean, it's a little bit kind of impressionisty. That maybe there's some kind of Goya in there as well. Actually, I'm just thinking now of some of the kind of darkness of faces. This is a portrait of Job, but kind of interesting. But by the time he's working in the 1910s, his styles are even more loose. There's definitely kind of some modernist elements to it, but it's still very realist. You can see in the face across here. This is a self-portrait, by the way. Now, he loves a self-portrait, and he sort of does a lot of dress up, and I can really appreciate that. As a someone who appreciates clothes.
True dandy.
Exactly. We're very much.
As am I.
Yeah. Exactly. But some of it, here's another self-portrait of him in Paris. Literally, I have no idea what he's wearing here. So
this one is a favorite of Mr. D, I believe. This picture, he showed it to me quite a few times, and that he's wearing there is the wonderful, very warm wonderful looking sheepskin vest that was given to British troops. I've actually I don't own one because they're all very vintage pieces now, but I've tried one on and they are very comfy. It's literally just a sheepskin with like armholes and like a some sort of like button mechanism at the front. Like it's very woolly. And being in Wales also, I have access to like sheepskins up to the rafters around here. So plenty of opportunity for sort of sheepskin.
This is it. We'll have to do like a series, like a limited edition, Pharaoh sheepskin branded merch. We'll make this look branded with a big F on the back.
Definitely. House of Pharaoh.
Yeah. Now some of his kind of more famous work was some of his landscapes, and again, he's brilliant at depicting these kind of quite dark scenes, but in a very different way to the way that we've seen some other people. So if you remember Osmond Spare, it's all about the kind of greens and darknesses. There's actually some kind of quite like light tones here. So again, there is a lot of brown. Like the subject matter is dark, but there is some brightness in there as well. So you can kind of see the kind of light breaking through the clouds atop there. There's a reflection in the river in this totally desolate and dark landscape. You've got this kind of dead soldier, almost like a saint laid out there. There's something like he's illuminated in the sun here. You've got this kind of foreground area here, and there is something almost religious about this painting, I think, but with a kind of sad melancholy and this dark chasm. I love this at the back end, this kind of mysterious cave that you don't know about, but it's the eye.
I was going to say that it's very sort of Lord of the Rings-esque, and then of course but of course this is what inspired a lot of the landscapes in those books, of course, because Tolkien was one of the writers who was out here at the time. In fact, he was.
The Dead Marshes were based on what he had seen. Out in no man's land.
Yes, and it's worth noting, I think, that I think he deserves a mention from what I've read of probably being at the absolute forefront of all the artists and writers, perhaps other than Ernst Junger, who went out, because you read about what he did in the war. He was involved in some of the most brutal attacks on the Somme. He was leading men over the top at the Somme and capturing ground. And there was one point during that where his entire battalion, except him, was wiped out through hand-to-hand fighting. So I think he was really at the forefront of this. Though, of course, interestingly, he didn't turn to modernism. If anything, he kind of went the other way and went sort of ultra trad. So interesting.
Speaking of trench warfare, his this is entitled "Dead Germans in a Trench," and this is what I'm saying about Orpen has these kind of like lighter scenes in his kind of tones and the colors that he's using.
Rather beautiful.
Exactly. There's a stillness to it. It's almost like you got this kind of beautiful blue light. We could be in a something kind of desert, Christmas or desert, or what I'm saying, this kind of serene landscape, but it's just this gruesome zombie-like figure at the bottom, which again is just chillingly, takes you to reality again and shows you where we are.
Sorry,
you go.
Just quickly on this point, I was reading an essay, but I can't remember who it was by. It was an artist, perhaps a poet, who went out to the First World War, and he said that he said basically what this piece seems to show, that he would be sat there in the mud, surrounded by corpses and rats and maggots and lice and men dying horribly around him, and then he would sort of look out over a bit of no man's land, and it would just get caught in a certain light in a certain way at a certain time, and it would look so shockingly beautiful. Just this slice of just pure sort of aesthetic nicety in the midst of all this horror, which is very much the vibe that this painting gives me.
No, definitely. I'm going to scoot through a few of these. He's also quite good at kind of depicting some of the kind of locals and the tragedy here. You've got the kind of the starving child looking towards the the viewer while the mother kind of takes out her breast to kind of feed the child. The crosses in the background reminiscent of death. But again, the colours are just so vibrant. Again, this is almost like an impressionistic skyline, you know, straight out of Monet or something. Maybe Manet, yeah. Let me skip ahead. This one's quite good. I like this one because it's called the Mad Woman of Douai. I'm sure again I have butchered the French here. Douai, Douai.
I'm not going to risk it.
And I believe that the story for this is there's this woman who was kind of like shell shocked by all of the kind of carnage, and she just sort of shouted out and was like relatively well known. But I just love the colours in this. You've got all these again. This is a layered painting. You've got kind of three major areas. You've got this kind of foreground space here, all with a green tint. Then you've got the kind of midground across here where you've got the collapsed church, and then the kind of background all in white. And there's lots of levels to this. You've got kind of like the demolished church, so the inner church. You've got Christ looking down on everyone, and again, it's interesting how Christ is. It's a very strange Christ. Normally, his arms would be across the cross. It's like his arms are almost up or maybe broken. The background, all of the rubble has been reduced to this kind of white level. It's almost like cinders or ash, but maybe something reminiscent about like a heavenly kingdom as well. You know, this kind of ghostly kingdom in the background, and then the foreground itself, this kind of farcical, almost Dadaist area where the mad woman, you know, everyone's kind of like laughing or trying to speak to her. And you've got the kind of soldiers just observing this moment, just trying to take a moment's rest. And then, most hideously of all, a dead body, which has been recently been buried here. Like the hat marking the grave, and the all you need is a single boot. I think that's just so beautiful and sinister and dark and wonderful.
Very shallow grave.
Yeah, exactly. So again, it's just a commentary on the madness of war, and it's a really great painting. I'm going to scoot through. His background was in portraiture. Did some very famous society portraits, and again, some really lovely works from here. Here's one of the kind of lieutenants.
It's a hell of an outfit.
Yep. And again, this is just an NCA pilot.
It's such a good outfit, though. I mean, I think we need to find a way to like bring back World War One like aviator aesthetics. Honestly, it's like I think this may be the actual peak of men's fashion. Right?
It will be too. I got to be honest. It'll be too warm. This is like so it's a leather coat with like a shearling inside. You'll just be sweating.
Well then, what we need to do is all learn to fly so we can wear this in the clouds where it's appropriate.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing where this style basically gets turned into the style in Cars. If you ever watch Poirot, you'll see Hastings, who's a massive car fanatic, basically has this get-up, but in the car. So I wonder if that sort of transitioned into the...
We all need to drive cabriolets. That's the answer.
Yes. Yeah. We need to buy like a vintage Hispano Sweezer and, you know, take to the roads in this gear. I mean, I like if I come into considerable money, I think one of the first things I will do is just learn to fly and then buy some old plane just to carry this off.
Just to buy planes.
Yeah.
But you see, when you're in the plane, no one's going to be able to see you. That's the problem.
But it's not about that. It's about knowing that you're doing it. You know,
it's the aesthetic experience. Then
yes.
That's peak hipster, though. I'm afraid.
No,
it's because you're doing it for himself rather than for someone else. That's the difference.
I'm not posing in it.
Hipsterdom is about creating a consumable image for other people to be part of their group.
You know, I'm not like AA wearing his cape to Asda. You know, this is very different.
Genuine aesthetic experience.
Yes.
Let's keep on going. More portraits. He also didn't just work in oils. He also did This says oil painting, but I'm sure this is
that's a pastel.
Watercolor.
No, I'm fairly sure that looks like pastel.
Okay, just because I've had some of his other works labeled as a watercolor as well, but it does look
well,
very
actually,
soft.
it might. I tell you what, it may be a combination of watercolor and some sort of dry medium, so maybe chalk or charcoal.
Okay, but again, this reminds me of Spare a little bit with some of his work. But I just love this scene. Again, these kind of beautiful and vengeful machines of war, the tanks, and this is sort of leaping up, almost like it's coming out of the sea here, like a whale breaching the sea, and it's about to crash down. This has got a lot of tension in the scene. Something's, the big weight's about to land down. There's another tank scene coming up as well. This is kind of four German prisoners in a French village. So again, it's not just some of his landscapes. He's creating these kind of interesting, I guess, kind of like almost realism pieces here, where you're capturing the kind of somber nature, but also kind of humanizing the enemy as well. These could be four Englishmen as much as
there's the Peter Jackson film from a few years ago, They Shall Not Grow Old, where he colorized the footage, and he cleaned up the interviews that the World War I vets gave in the 60s. One of the things they keep saying in that film is that when they sort of captured Germans and took them behind the lines, they were very keen to just sort of make friends with them, because they seemed so sort of like, I mean, they were just like this, they were just like some lads, that they'd make friends with, and sort of they found them quite interesting in that sort of way, that they were just, very similar sort of blokes, just from a different part of Europe.
Yeah, I think also if we ever do a stream on Egon Schiele, probably an X-rated stream, I should imagine. He did
after hours, yeah.
Yes, he did. Yes, private access. He did do a fantastic series. He served in the Austrian army, and he did do a series of fantastic portraits of Russian prisoners of war. So they're worth including alongside the more notable nudes and portraits.
Interesting. No, I didn't know that about him. So, he's quite good. This is a self-portrait as the thinker in his full kit.
He did rather love his self-image, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he's Irish.
Narcissus in the lake,
He's a bit of a natural shit poster. You know what I'm saying? If he was on Twitter today, he would just be constantly churning out
selfies,
hilarious memes. Selfies and hilarious memes. I quite like this as like a reflection on a classic work, and again, just this moment of thought in a field of death and solitude as well. So, here's the other tanks one, but I don't think it's as good as the first work. But
I think you were very keen to compare them to like whales, like coming out of an ocean. There's something very nautical about this, isn't there? Everything is sort of waves and strokes of color. And in fact, that tank about to like collapse down there. Whenever they did that, there's a short anecdote about King George being taken to witness some tanks in the rear lines in France, and the tank kind of came over the hill like that, came crashing down, and then the crew got out to salute the king, but only two of them actually came out, because the rest of them were all knocked unconscious by the great, because there were no. So there's no suspension or any kind of shock absorber in that. It's just a big metal box like crashing down a hill.
Yes, I'm not sure they even had sort of seatbelts or restraints or anything.
No,
it was just simply
nothing.
You had to brace yourself.
You just crouched in this metal box. You held onto a gun or something.
Oh, the old death box there.
And the noise and the fumes were incredible.
Yeah, there was.
Check out Lindy Beige's videos on sort of the First World War tanks.
There was no exhaust, and it was just literally a huge engine in there with you, just coughing out what engines cough out.
It was extremely hot.
One of the worst jobs in this war was being in a tank.
Horrible.
Yeah.
Okay. let's just a couple of last one. This was kind of, I think it's called like blown up mad. It's known as, and I believe there is a poem with a similar name, and Orpen knew Sassoon, and they sort of hung out together for a while,
Right.
which is interesting. So again, and yeah, this is a soldier. He's been recently shell shocked and has gone totally insane. You can see again that there is something again almost religious about some of his paintings, and again that's why I put Job at the start to show that he had this kind of religious trend to it. This could be like a saint, but it's kind of like an inverted icon, and without any kind of positivity or transcendence. It's kind of like this is just the harsh brutality. Okay, two last things of his. So he created a huge amount of content, really worth checking out. This is just the tip of the iceberg of some of his stuff. Two of his most famous works were at the end of the war, and this is the famous signing of the peace in the Hall of Mirrors. So this is after the old train carriage armistice signing. So that's the kind of first round. This is the full piece, and he's tried to capture the kind of official moment of signing. And I'm relying on Hats to rely. I mean, we can all know.
We all know. I won't even say that monster's name.
W star.
The American
LSON.
president. Yeah, there he is.
Exactly.
You have Georges Clemenceau with the great moustache. You have the Welsh wizard Lloyd George. You have Andrew Bonar Law to his right, the Conservative leader who would replace him as Prime Minister. Between them is Field Marshal Viceroy Maharaja Sir Ganga Singh, who was the Maharaja of Bikaner in India, and I believe the highest-ranking Indian officer of the war, with an exemplary war record, and came from a great kind of Hindu warrior lineage. And that's one of the best things about. I think this is certainly one of the most like cinematic or kind of storybook-esque wars that occurred. You know, very, very kind of epic in its scale. You know, the idea of this army of like 1 million like Hindu Muslim warriors coming over from India to fight for the British in France. You know, one of those. I'm not sure. I think it's the one to the left of the American. Is Orlando, the Italian Prime Minister, who, I mean, I don't think we have time to get into the situation of Italy at this time, but let's just say it's not good. And there's a reason that barely like 2 years after Mussolini would be in power there, didn't go so well for them.
Do you want to guess where the Japanese are?
They are in it. Yep, there they are.
Tucked away.
You know,
literally did nothing. Good job, Japs.
Well, I mean, they captured a few German possessions in the east for their own gain. So you know, they sort of had to be there.
This is the token placement, basically.
Yeah. See who else is here. That guy on the tucked away with the sort of white beard next to the soldier in the helmet on the far left.
Oh, right.
Is I can't pronounce his name. It's something like Venizelos. He was the Greek prime minister, who was very important because he was like sort of a liberal nationalist, quite revolutionary, and he was opposed by the Greek monarchy and the conservatives in Greece, and he faced a civil war when he went home. I think that's all I can name.
Well,
it does kind of remind me of the Sgt. Pepper's cover. Or his luminaries from this
image.
I mean,
perhaps
that's harsh. I was going to compare it more to the sergeant image. I mean, there's something less grand about it, and again, because of the nature of everyone here, they do feel a little bit independent. But I think they've sort of captured the sense of the moment a little bit. But yeah, sorry.
Now, of course, the painting of all the generals that we looked at by Sargent. Now, I think Alexander said that obviously they weren't all stood together to be painted. They were painted individually. Was this captured at the signing, or were they all?
I imagine what happened was there was a series of photographs taken. He has combined a series of photographs and also added in. You'll see that the lights of the faces is not completely consistent and not consistent between and their bodies and the heads. So what's happened is he's added in typical portraits over the figures. I imagine that these probably were the figures as they were standing or seated.
Yeah.
But what he's done is he's added the portraits.
There is a photo
taken
of it
from photographs,
which is similar to that, but it's much longer from what I've seen. But Wilson's light is wrong. Can you see it's all on the right hand side of the face, where it's much more diffuse and it feels like he's out of place. Just a quick note, obviously Hall of Mirrors, you can see behind. So again, he's the Orpen's giving a little interesting view, so you can see that the reflection of this guy here. You've got the reflection of the German across here, and then the artist is here, and he's got no easel at all. So it's an interesting self-portrait as a shadow, and maybe he's kind of reflecting upon his place, the shadow of all of the men who died to create this moment. And again, just look at the scale of the painting. I think it's really interesting. All of the actions going down at the bottom. Everything else is reserved for the heavens and the height and this glory and this beautiful location, which I think is very interesting.
What does it say up there at the top? Is there text there? Yeah,
King governs.
Yeah. So it's from the Hall of Mirrors, and there is quite a sort of Last Supper vibe to this, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah, but they're all seated like that.
I mean, you can tell
the German there.
I mean, you can tell the tension there as well. Just like just the sadness. Just again, that's a great moment he's just captured here, just between these two, I think, and that's what's more interesting for me. So,
the way all those leaders in the middle are looking sort of victoriously, sort of down their noses at the signatory for Germany there as well.
If you do a close up on the back, on the chair back, what you'll see is there's like a grid system. What you'll find is that the way the picture was traditionally transferred was you would have a drawing or a photograph and you would draw a grid over it, and then you would do a grid, a commensurate grid on your canvas, and you would just copy square by square, so you could actually transfer a very small drawing onto a large surface. This was a common practice from the Renaissance times onwards, and something that an artist called Sickert did, Richard Sickert, Walter Sickert, he tended to leave the grid visible because, being a good modernist, what he wanted to do was to make clear to people the artifice involved in making this picture. And Orpen has clearly picked up on Sickert, who was doing this a few years earlier, and he's carried on, and he's revealing a little bit of the technique of how the picture was made, and that adds a touch of modernism to it.
Yeah. Interesting. I wonder whether there's a specific reason why he chose to put it around the Germans as well. But interesting moment. We're running out of time dramatically. Last one from him is the to the unknown soldier, the unknown British soldier in France. And again, I think it's meant to be in Versailles. This tomb with the British flag placed over, and again, it's just this very beautiful, solemn moment of remembrance and pathos, where you've got this kind of light in the distance here, darkness all around. The whole tone of the paintings. Consider how light his tones are in his other paintings. There is a real somberness here. Yeah,
and it is like the inside of a pharaoh's tomb, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
Is there time for a quick anecdote on this, or
go on?
So, yes, it's important to remember that like all wars, with the First World War, there were millions and millions of parents and families and friends who did not know what had happened to their loved ones that had gone missing or died in the war. Let's imagine a battalion goes over the top and like half of them are left at the end of the attack. You can't account for all the troops that have gone missing. Some of them will have been seen to die. Some of the bodies will be recovered. Some of them will just go missing, and you will never know. You'll never know where their remains ended up or what happened to them, or even if they're alive or dead. And that's why they did this Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, because it meant that all of the families that had lost people with no recollection or trace of where they'd gone could look upon this and imagine that it could be their son, or it could be their husband, it could be their brother, it might be them, It was the process for this was that a general was taken into a room with a blindfold on, with 6 randomly recovered corpses in coffins from the front line, and he put his hand on one of them at random, and that's how they chose this. The point was it could literally be any British soldier that had gone missing in the war.
Good fact.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the end of my section. With my artist. We're desperately running out of time. Do you want to? Should we give this a go, Hats? You're up next, and
what's our time cap? What are we going up to?
We'll go to the hour. So
all right, that's no worries. I can wrap this up. So yes, this is a picture of try and pronounce his name properly, Erich Maria Remarque, who was the author of. I'm going to try. I prepared beforehand to try and get this right. Investor nicht Neues, I believe is how you say it. But in English, it's All Quiet on the Western Front. In German, it's Nothing New in the West. And so, of course, he was an artist. He was a writer, not an artist, but I think this still applies, who went to war as a young man. He joined up in 1916, I believe. And by the end of the war, his enthusiasm for it was completely dead. He regretted it entirely. He hated the experience, and again that thing we talked about earlier about how the fact that as a soldier in this war you're never safe. You never get a break. You never get 5 minutes even away from artillery shells and gas and all sorts of horrible things. You're surrounded by this stinking mess of corpses and rats and maggots, and at any minute you'll be sent over the top to die, or you'll just die of boredom, lying in a trench for months on end. And that's what he depicted in the book, All Quiet on the Western Front. It is very much a kind of, I don't want to say anti-war because I hate that term. And I don't think there's any such thing as an anti-war piece of media. But it's very much a stark depiction of the First World War. And he drew a lot of criticism from the, not just the left, but not just the right, but lots of factions for his kind of portrayal. It was considered a kind of very unpatriotic, un-Germanic way to depict the war, and he was constantly, because his last name has French origins. He was considered like a sort of effeminate, sort of French type of writer. It's if you're a German, you have to portray the war heroically. And the book itself is actually starkly funny, All Quiet on the Western Front, in some ways, because it's just this little gang of German troops just being frustrated and annoyed all the time at the front line and getting into scrapes in like French villages and stuff, and then they'll get killed apart from him. And again, just the kind of, you wouldn't have had this like 40 years earlier, say, in the American Civil War. That was still a kind of Roman conception of war, where you're this big army that moves around and then you stand on a field and you have a battle. This wasn't that anymore. This was just being stuck in a muddy hole with death all around you. So yes.
Sorry, I've got a question. On Women's Hour, there was this discussion of the Pickelhaube. Was the spike on the famous German or Prussian military helmet, was that used in battle, or what was the thinking?
First of all, we need to address the Women's Hour dictator chic plagiarization controversy.
Oh yes, actually,
because I have to. Pharaoh mentioned this to me the other morning, that it was actually us three. It was this very channel that pioneered the person of power clothing chic, and I feel like we're being ripped. But I feel like adequate credit was not given.
To be fair, some credit was paid. Yes.
Okay.
But yes, we did get in first.
Okay.
I think it's just reinforced AA's point that women don't come up with original ideas, and it's just they just
hang on.
Well, to be fair, they were presented with this subject by AA.
Okay.
So perhaps we should be including him.
Perhaps.
No criticism.
And I know that AA is a watcher of this channel because he's been in the chat before. So it's not like he doesn't know.
So that the spike on the Pickelhaube.
It wasn't used for combat. It was a Prussian tradition which has something to do with cavalry attacks. I believe it was something to do with when a cavalryman would swing a sword at your head, the spike would disrupt the sword swing, or it would catch, or something like that. But I can't explicitly remember. But was it used in combat? No. It's just it's too. The ones that were given to ordinary troops were far too low quality to have any kind of spiking value. It would just snap off.
Spiking,
yeah,
I used it for marshmallows, but not much more.
Yeah. You could sort of stick a piece of toast on it, but that was about it.
I like the tactical camouflaging of it as well.
Yeah, they all had to be covered up. Partly because sorry.
No, you go.
Partly because that Pickelhaube, you wore it into combat, but it was also your parade dress. So whenever like a senior officer came by and you had to get all dressed up, that Pickelhaube had to be gleaming.
Yeah, I imagine that's a nightmare, basically.
This is something that's afflicted all armies all through history, is the fact that you're there to fight, but occasionally some peacock officer will come by and you've got to get dressed up in your finest that you've had to keep clean, and spotless while you're surrounded by all this mud and attrition. And if you don't, you get punished. So the Pickelhaube, I will note, was discontinued by 1916. It was simply not practical, especially since that trench warfare is all about crouching and ducking under like low beams of wood. And this big spike was just, you're probably better off not even wearing the helmet, frankly. At that point. Yes, there were even, because the German economy was in such dire straits, there were even papier-mâché Pickelhaubes that were issued. Literally just a papier-mâché one with a spike. What good that would do, is beyond me. But that was
prosthetic Pickelhaubes.
Kind of, yeah.
We've completed the circle.
Full circle.
Yeah, but of course it was Prussian pride. But of course, the Germans, being the aestheticists that they are, replaced it with arguably the even more iconic Stahlhelm, that would go on to define sort of German military chic, all through up until the Second World War. The iconic German helmet, if you think of that. So yeah, there you go. The Germans lost an iconic hat, but they replaced it with another one. So
okay. Oh, his header book.
Yeah, I'll try it again. In Western Nichtes Neues.
I love the use of Gothic font, because the Germans basically loved Gothic font for way too long. Like, I find it almost unreadable, basically. But
yes,
it's very popular even into the 19th century, where books were entirely printed in Gothic.
So, you look at those like old German Lutheran Bibles and stuff, where it's just unreadable because of
this. That's what I'm saying. It's like, I can understand that when it's the first printing press, but
revived in the 1930s, I believe.
Although I believe it was banned. It was banned by the Nazis, wasn't it? Didn't the I think the Nazis banned it because it was originally designed by a Jew. Yeah, I think so. I remember reading that they switched it out for something else.
Yeah, like this. It was a popular font during the 19th century. So again, like everyone else had readable books apart from the Germans.
I imagine they didn't go for Comic Sans. That doesn't sound very mid-century German. It's not. You can't take them terribly seriously if they're using Comic Sans.
Yeah. Okay, who's next?
That is Otto Dix. I'm not sure what the context of this image is. At first, I thought it was like one of those headshots where they sort of cut out your face, but you can see he's actually wearing a white sweater of some kind. Yes, that's Otto Dix glowering out there, looking very German. Yes, this is kind of a. I believe, if I'm not wrong, I think he made this like in the war. Like he composed this while, at least partially while at the front. I may be wrong there though.
Yeah, I believe he did do so. He did do some sketches. Yes.
Yeah.
Is this not an etching as well? Because I think he.
Yeah, this one's an etching.
Of this.
It's based on drawings that he did at the time.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Any comments on this, Alexander?
Yeah. So I think this is an extremely effective image. It's very good at suggesting the dehumanization of war, especially even though, interestingly enough, he's drawing his own side. So you notice he's kind of showing a degree of alienation from his comrades.
And so, do you know much about his journey through the First World War?
Yes. So he was somebody who signed up in 1914, right at the start. He volunteered, like many Germans, with absolute dedication to the cause. I believe I think how old he was. He was born in 1891. So he had served. He had well, it is Germany, I suppose. He had been in the I'll try and get this right, Kunstgewerbeschule in Dresden, which is now the Dresden.
That would be the applied art school.
Yeah, and it's now the Dresden Academy of Fine Arts. Yes, he trained. I believe he actually didn't so much train as a painter, but more as a kind of craftsman. There was a heavy focus on like craft and sculpture more so than painting, I think. But he did paint, and he did kind of very realist landscapes and portraits originally, and then more or less while he was in the war, he completely turned everything on its head and started to do these etchings. And he collected these in a portfolio called the Der Krieg, or the war. I mean, this that's really as simple as it was. He tried to apply for the Air Force in 1918, but he was shot while training through the neck, and he received treatment for that. But yeah, I mean, he went to the war and he saw such horrible things that he decided that he was gonna do this kind of art to show them off. Yes, this is what he also was a very active painter in the Weimar Republic after the war, and he does lots of paintings which are titled things like "Pillars of Society," or I mean, this is a pretty good glimpse into sort of like 20s underground Berlin. I mean, lots of quite tartish women, down and out sort of men, Negro jazz,
American jazz music.
Yeah, prostitutes, swing music, and flappers. I mean, he doesn't exactly portray this as the most happy looking of times, does he?
What he's calling up? That's the question I'm wondering. He's kind of like surrounded by this madness. Also, this woman's waist is just like insane. Basically, it's almost like this surreal character.
Is it that she has a too small waist or a too large bust?
Well, you can never have a too large bust, Panama. So.
That's got to be clipped. Yeah, I mean, I think I've said. I mean, I don't know who he's calling, but I mean, I quite like that he's very anti-American in this. Clearly, like as you said, there's the kind of Negro American jazz and the Native American on the drum.
I mean, that's almost that's a demonic face there.
Yes, yes, this is a demon come across the Atlantic. I mean, that's how I feel about American influence in Europe, certainly. So
again, Otto Dix, we'll see him in some kind of like diverse. This will be on the poster.
Yeah, it turns out Otto Dix loved blacks. He was a champion of them.
I sort of love this character in the background here. Just again, like the waiting staff. There's one across here as well. Just kind of the pose is just that kind of the classic slouch of service here.
Mm-hmm.
But this one in particular is just this sinister figure.
Yes.
Yeah, almost kind of like a dagger in the darkness there. That's a very cool picture. Okay.
This is just a depiction of worms and maggots and bits of grass on a skull. Bear in mind that he would have been surrounded by this. I mean, I also like that there's kind of, you can still see the moustache is still on the skull, the remains of the moustache there. I mean, this is just like a literal depiction of what you would have seen. That if you read accounts of soldiers of the First World War about the rats and the maggots and the lice and the other kind of cats as well, a lot of cats made their way into the trenches to get in on this. I mean, this was like you're just surrounded by all this rotting matter, and there are all these horrible stories of British troops digging trenches, and they put a spade into the wall of their trench, and like this horrible maggot infested like corpse just falls out with all the viscera and all the other horrible things that happen to a decaying corpse. Like one of this is really what turned Otto Dix into who he was this utterly gruesome depiction of everything around him. And I mean, it's a similar mental process to Oscar Wilde after he went to prison, because the whole reason that he kind of stopped doing anything after that was because he had been confronted with something so horrible that his old self couldn't have imagined it. Basically, that's what happened to Otto Dix. You can't even fathom what you're going to see in the war, and then it's just there around you all day for 4 years.
What this reminds me of is like a Germanic Renaissance woodcut of a skull, because they'd often have things like that. So I wonder if again the Germans just can't get away from that kind of the grotesque.
The Gothic grotesque.
Yeah, exactly.
So obviously I put out a video about Yukio Mishima recently, and I was thinking about how the Japanese as a whole tend to kind of fetishize death in an almost kind of sexual way. Do you think the same could be said of the Germanic people, or at least the Prussians, about this kind of love of death?
I don't think it's sexual, but I think they're very in tune with it. So again, like if you think about some of Holbein's work as well, there'll be like skeletons dancing around, etc. This kind of like Alexander said, this kind of Gothic grotesque. You
also find that in Bosch, who's obviously not German but sort of Dutch and Flemish.
Germanic,
And you also find that there's sort of this Nordic propensity towards gloom and melancholy and introspection, and you often find this in the Russian authors and the Russian artists and so forth. So I think it's definitely a northern sensibility. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you imagine a Med putting out something like this?
No. Meds wouldn't do it. Because Meds are civilized. They would. This would be exactly. This would be like a depiction of the Virgin Mary if this was a Med. That's probably a bit harsh on the Med pair. I am entirely pro Med and anti germ, so I'll reveal my bias there. Love the Meds. This is one of his most famous. I think it's probably the most famous piece. I remember seeing this as a kid and being genuinely quite shocked by it. I mean, it's I believe it's called Cripples, War Cripples. And I think what really makes it stand out is that they're all obviously horribly mutilated by the war, but they seem to be having a great time. They seem to be absolutely living it up here, playing cards, wearing military uniforms, clearly. None of them have any legs. They just have like stumps. They're all kind of torn up, and the one on the left is like grinning despite not really having a face to grin with this weird kind of Lovecraftian ear trumpet thing.
There's a few things that's interesting for me. Firstly, you've got the newspapers on a stick. So it's a popular thing in Austria and some parts of Germany where as you enter a cafe, all of today's papers will be lined up on sticks. And
that's quite cool, actually.
Yeah, you can read through it and then return it. So it's kind of like a hygienic way of maintaining a paper, and also making sure that people don't crease them.
Yeah. Or also put them in their bags and walk off with them.
Yes, also true. And then you've got the kind of the legs of the chairs. So I think there's a joke here about half, like one guy's literally legless.
Yeah.
This guy here, he's got 2 peg legs, and this guy's got 1 peg leg.
They're turning
And
into the furniture.
yes, exactly. So there's the kind of the interplay between that, and then, like you said, the machines have turned man into a machine. There's something about that as well, where again it's kind of like, you know,
there's clearly
mechanized.
that's a false arm coming over the top of his head to hold a card up.
So this is sort of proto-transhumanism.
It is,
in a way.
yeah.
What do you chaps make of the portrayal of the sort of like the scene here and the sort of the background and the way he's painted the figures? Was this something sort of artistically revolutionary, or is he drawing on something earlier?
It's very cubist in its outlook.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think these are actual newspapers, aren't they? These that have been pasted on, rather than if you can do a close up. I think these are actual. Yeah, these are actual newspapers. You see, they've darkened. Well, what's happened is that's what happens with wood pulp, is that it darkens over time. So what he's done the cubist thing of actually pasting in newspaper cuttings, which is what the cubists did in sort of around 1912.
Just a few things just observed. You can see all their cards, and I think that's quite interesting. Everything's been displayed, so the hands are open. Also, fun fact: they're using the German suits. I don't know if you know this, but obviously we have clubs, spades, hearts, and diamonds.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure it's hearts, oak seeds.
Well, they have their own decks.
Yes, this is it.
Yeah, and cups. I think wasn't one of them on cups.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
there's lots.
Well, the French had different ones as well. Yeah.
Also, I've literally only just realised he's holding his hand of cards with his foot.
Yeah,
it's very bizarre. Yeah, with his backwards foot.
Yeah, but it's very dark, and again, the tote light here.
There it is. Yeah. Oh, hello to Mr. D in the chat,
and hello to Lady of Shalott as well.
Yes, who is very much on side with the plagiarism incident.
Well, I have conflicting loyalties, which I'm not going to go into, but I do believe the subject of dictatorship was presented to Women's Hour, and they accepted.
I think we all know you're divided your loyalties here. Yeah.
Yes.
Oof.
Okay. Next.
Yeah, I believe this is another. Unless I'm wrong, I think this is another Otto Dix. Very similar to the ones we looked at the start. This kind of very stark depiction of a war wound. I mean, I'm not sure if this is a very over-exaggerated one, or if I hope to God for this man's sake that this was not actually the wound that he had to live with. I mean, if it was, then God above,
unthinkable, isn't it?
Yeah, but it is possible. I mean, you could.
It's interesting comparing it to the Tonks. So again, Tonks, it's all about the face. Everything else sort of melded away, but you've got more of the figure in here. There's more detail in the hair, and actually, it'd be quite a beautiful portrait if you didn't have this kind of horrific wound on the face. And again, look at the colours being used here. Like, is it like pen and ink and watercolor maybe, or like a couple
splashes on the forehead as well.
Yeah, exactly. But then it's just the colours are just so rich. It's almost like surreal.
You're not even really sure what you're looking at that point. I mean, it's like the face has just been sort of torn away, but it's the head is still there. You can see the outline of the head on the left side, despite the huge wound. I mean, as I say, I hope to God that this was not a survivor of that wound, but yes, it may very well have been. Many such wounds were suffered. Yes, this is one of his post World War I Weimar paintings. Something interesting about Otto Dix is that he catches on to he kind of is like the original Hitler hater. Like he was like talking about how much he didn't like the Nazis when they were just like 12 guys in a pub. He caught on to them very early. And I think you can see on the man's jacket there, is that a swastika or a cross? No, it's a cross. in one of the other ones here, there's a man with a swastika tie pin, which is very interesting. But yes, I mean, the whole energy here is brokenness and chaos. You know, it's the world turned upside down. Nothing makes sense. Everyone is wounded by the war. You know, and I mean, you have to remember. So you've just had World War One. Germany is bankrupt. There's starvation everywhere. There's homeless veterans all over the streets. Political chaos. And there's just been the Spanish flu, which has wiped out another like 5 million people. So you would think you were living in like literally just the apocalypse was upon you if you were a German in this time. I mean, truly horrific stuff. Everybody knew somebody that had died to the war or the flu. Nobody had any money. Everything was just falling into a shambles. You know, the Kaiser fled. The new government was basically meaningless and disoriented.
Malnutrition was rife.
Yes, very much so. I mean, this is a very accurate, sensual depiction of Germany after the war.
There's a few things interesting that I'm going to just bring up. You can see obviously the kind of two disabled figures are in view, but the person who's kind of giving the cash is out of view, so you never see the kind of alive and well people. I mean, even this, but he's sort of like mechanized, this guy across here. Yeah. So you've got this guy with a cane. For me, he's kind of representing, again, the kind of like the bourgeois factory owner. Let's just say the recently enriched new class that's taking over a large part of Germany, maybe, let's just say. Indeed. And his dog who's kind of like viciously howling at the disabled, you know, just utter scorn. Or again, this kind of woman passing by. Also a note, you know, invented glam rock. Otto Dix invented glam rock.
Rocky Horror.
That's something for the David Bowie stream.
Notice how she's also kind of obscenely posed as well, by the looks of it.
Yes, interesting, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the woman in the background, well, it doesn't appear to be a woman, it appears to be a kind of mannequin with sort of parts. I mean, I imagine it's prosthetics for sale.
Yeah, but it's a juxtaposition because you've got like, you know, women's hair accessories on the left. You know, that was the world they knew, and now the world they now know is look at the hand that you can buy instead of the kind of beauty. You know, it's very sad. Anything on this, Alexander?
No, that I think is a very good example. It's worth taking a look at something that Peter Bruegel painted, which is called The Beggars, and it's a scene of legless beggars, basically sort of in a very similar sort of position. That was done sort of almost 400 years earlier.
You two said that the last piece you felt was kind of cubist. What do you make of this one?
Well, yes, this also is sort of semi-cubist in that it's extremely flat. You know, spatially speaking, that there's not much depth. And you've got, and again, you've got the collage element. So you've got the collaged cutout of the newspaper under his sort of cart, as it were. Yeah.
Just something else I've noticed. You know, I kept mentioning these kind of memento moris in his work. There is the spectre of death in this. I don't know if you can see this here. Look at the green line, or this kind of grey-green line here. What you've got here is a foot down here. You've got a hand that sort of curves around the head, and then another hand, and then another foot down here, and then this line across here, which is holding a scythe.
Yeah.
And that looks like a postage stamp.
Yeah.
And like an actual postage stamp.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, is it still legal tender? I don't know.
I think that it's just
meant to be. I wonder whether you could trade it in for cash or something.
Maybe. I mean, maybe it's kind of a joke in that the beggar is perhaps blind, and he's just the person is handing him something that's not money.
Yes, yeah, it could be. Yeah.
Okay.
This is a painting. This is a portrait he did. God, it slipped my mind now who exactly it was. It was a portrait of a post-war figure, and I had to put it in just because it's like, you know, this may have been the most black-pilled man who ever lived. I think was Otto Dix. I mean, even the portraits, they just look like, you know, deathly corpses with jaundiced eyes. You know. the notice how the clothes he's wearing and the collar appear to be sort of dominating him, like it's a corpse, like dressed up for a service.
It's Edwardian clothing as well, so it's pre-war clothing.
Mm-hmm. It's just the sheer misery of it. I mean, look at that face. What more can I say?
It was
exactly. How bad things really are. Terrible situation. Yep, this is the front cover of an edition of Storm of Steel that Ernst Junger wrote. And the reason I brought up Junger is because all of the, or most of the painters, and especially the writers that we've talked about so far, they went to war very enthusiastically, and within a very short time, they hated it. And then when it ended, they were completely dead. Basically, they couldn't. They had been completely torn apart by what they'd seen. And, especially Otto Dix and Eric Maria Remarque, as we said. But Ernst Junger was one of the few people who went to war in 1914, served in the thickest of the worst conditions, and by 1918 was still just as enthusiastic. I mean, he was a true believer in the cause of the war. And obviously afterwards he writes Storm of Steel, which is basically it's not pro-war in a kind of jingoistic sense. It's just pro-war, full stop. Like it's a kind of aesthetic appreciation of war, and a kind of a sensual one too. He is saying that, well, look, you don't have to go to war and be miserable. You can go to war and literally just have a kind of artistic time of your life, among all this utterly horrible stuff. There is a way to kind of metaphysically enjoy war. Is the vibe that the book very much gives off when you read it. Because obviously he's still doing terrible things and he's seeing horrible things and brutal things are happening all around him. But he has this endless just joie de vivre for everything that's going on. He isn't saying it's good, but he's just saying that you don't have to wallow in it, that strikes me as a strong departure from what we've looked at so far.
Do you know who else had a similar total love for the First World War from the Allied side?
Go on.
A one Winston Churchill, who quite candidly just said how he just didn't care. Yeah, exactly. He just didn't care, but he just loved every second of it. He's like, I don't care if tens of thousands of people have died. This is the best moment ever.
Well, to be fair, he wasn't actually on the front line, so.
Well, no. To be fair, he was. He after the disgrace of Gallipoli, because of course by the time the war started, he was a cabinet level politician. He'd been in politics for 15 years, and he'd made a career out of it. And then he was first Sea Lord when Gallipoli happened, and he took the blame. And he was basically forced out of politics. And prior to being a politician, he'd been a soldier. I mean, I am very anti Churchill, but I do credit where credit's due. He was no coward, and he signed up to be it was a Scottish battalion he went with to the front line, and he went over the top with his men. He didn't have to. He was commissioned as a. I didn't know about that side. He was commissioned as a brigadier general or a colonel or thereabouts. So he didn't have to go over the top, but he did quite a few times with his men. And of course, he had fought in South Africa in the Boer War. He was part of the cavalry charge of the Lancers at Omdurman. As I said, I'm very anti-Churchill in general, but credit where credit's due. The man knew how to fight. He didn't shy away from it.
Well, I think that's the difference, though, between Junger and Tim, is that, like, Churchill just loved. He was possessed by the spirit of Mars, let's just say.
Yeah.
While I think Junger, again, it's interesting, that aesthetic idea of war, and that's very different, I think. But yes. Okay, let's see the last. The last little bit. This picture of him there.
There is Ernst Junger during the war. That was just to provide a picture of what he looked like. I'm sure most people watching this already know about him. Notice the Iron Cross, of course, and it's got a French name, the Prussian award. It's called Pour la Mérite, I think. The star around the collar there, which is one of the highest awards for bravery. I mean, he was, I think like you say, he was kind of this, like Churchill, somebody who just loved the fight. But at the same time, he was way more philosophical than Churchill. I think, as you say, Churchill just loved to brawl in a way. You know, he just wanted to be out in the action. But I think Younger was always a thinker, always somebody kind of trying to put this into a frame. And his major kind of contribution, which is again such a shame that he's so ignored by the mainstream, is that everybody says that the First World War was this kind of pointless cauldron of death, but he said, well, what if war itself provides its own purpose and therefore meaning? You know, what if that is the case, that simply the act of fighting, no, even if you're you know you're no longer a kind of noble knight going one-on-one against a foe, even if you're kind of a one of a million amidst the literal storm of steel, what if even then you could be strong-willed and masculine enough to find meaning in it, and go on and find life in it and find purpose in it? You know, again, very very radical. I'm quite glad we did them at the end because it's such a kind of radical palate cleanser to so much of what is said about the First World War. And to this day, I mean, I can't really tell whether Younger was, you know, genuinely a kind of philosophical strongman genius or whether he was just sort of mad. But you know, very much worth reading his work on the First and Second World Wars. Yeah, or both. And I mean, it's worth saying as well, he lived from like 1892 to like 1999. He lived an incredibly long life. Saw basically the entire century go by. Yeah. So yeah, he had the experience.
Okay.
I'm awaiting your follow-up to Count Dankula's series, Mad Lads. This is obviously what you need to do. Reactionary Mad Lads.
Yes, indeed. That might not be a bad idea. Well, I sort of do have that on my channel. Quick shell. Video on Yukio Mishima, absolute mad lad. Came out yesterday.
We haven't even got to the shilling section yet.
I just thought I'd jump ahead there. Opportunity.
Outrageous double shilling.
Come on now. I thought that as an ad man you would appreciate that. You know.
No, it's scurrilous. There's designated areas for activities.
You have befouled the stream.
Exactly. Okay, we actually have tons more content, so I think, as ever, we may need to turn it into part 3. Although maybe we'll take a break to do the Dagar stream because I'm keen to do that in April.
Base Dagar
as it launches this month. But I think an interesting romp through some more artists. Alex, any kind of last takes on today's artists?
Yes, fascinating selection. We haven't touched upon, although we should perhaps have touched on the American artists. Obviously, the Americans only in it for 1 year, so not much art produced by the Americans. That's if you're excluding Sargent, who was actually an American citizen. But yes, some fascinating artists, and obviously a crucial event in the formation of the outlook of a large number of artists who didn't actually make war art per se. So there's a whole list of artists you could list who went on to be absolutely crucial figures in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, who experienced the war, had very active wars, but didn't actually produce war art per se. So so the influence of the war was even greater than we've been suggesting here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the people that I was really hoping to cover tonight was Sergeant Jagger, who ended up doing a whole lot of war memorials, and so there's multiple secondary effects and waves beyond beyond
and
the war.
The surrealists. I mean, many of the surrealists who became famous in the 20s and 30s or was served in the war, often on different sides. Like Max Ernst served in the German side, and André Breton, the leader of the French Surrealists, was on the French side.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess they sort of got on better. Like I think, like Kat said about the German prisoners, I imagine that the wounds weren't quite so bad. I don't know compared to the Second World War, but maybe that's just because of the propaganda levels. But anyway, okay, Hat, any kind of thoughts on this week's works?
I mean, I think I've spoken enough on all this. I mean, just to sum up, I mean, yeah, you can see why art began to change so radically with what happened, and why it was so. Why, unlike other wars, it seemed to literally just sort of completely kick a new life into art and the way artists worked, and why it basically changed everything. I mean, you've seen some of the most frank depictions of human suffering, I think, that we have in Western art, and that was the catalyst for change, in my opinion.
Also worth mentioning, a lot of artists drew religious parallels, so there was often a correlation between the suffering of soldiers and the suffering of Christ, or the suffering of martyrs. And this was, I think you've discussed this before, Pharaoh, the use of religious imagery in war propaganda. So there is a clearly an explicit link between the suffering of religious art and the suffering in this war art.
No, exactly. Just I think both from a technical perspective and also from like a symbolic and iconographic perspective as well. Okay. Let's finish up by just doing some shills. So, Alex, obviously a lot on. April is finally here.
April is finally here. Yes. So I'll mention my two small books that are available now. So that's a book of poems about Francis Bacon, the artist Francis Bacon, called After Francis Bacon, is available if you want to contact me directly through Twitter, direct messages, or through the website alexanderadams.com. If you're in Britain, you can just buy it through Amazon, just order through Amazon. There is also a very small pamphlet on the arts called Towards a Based Barbican. You can also get that through Amazon in the UK or directly from me. Later on this month, Pastels will be publishing my book called Degas, and Pharaoh has very kindly agreed that we will do a discussion about Degas later in the month, or I suppose maybe beginning of May or something. So thank you very much in advance for anyone who wants to purchase any of those.
Where can you pre-order the book? Is it the pre-order?
The Pastels, anywhere in the world, from any bookshop or any book selling website, because Pastels is a very big publisher. It's part of Penguin, so basically it's got worldwide distribution. So
total coverage.
Total
coverage. We are on the way to the mainstream, chaps.
You have no excuse.
No,
you cannot evade.
There is no bookstore in the world where you cannot buy an Alexander Adams. Okay, they are. It's like they're everywhere. Okay, so there's no excuse. Yes, This is if you want based art to flourish, get out there and buy Alexander Adams's books.
Thank you.
When mine come out, you need to buy those too.
Yes,
because
I want to see a picture of people in the most obscure bookshops in their country
holding copies of this book.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even if it takes like 8 weeks to get there, you have to order it in the bookshop and show it to us. Yes.
From some kind of the dark valleys of a Welsh backwater, and the world's oldest Waterstones bookshop, decrepit, but inside a golden light peers through from the collapsed roof, and illuminated out of the darkness is Alexander Adams' book on Degas, and that's the photo you need to take. So
yes,
thank you.
Come on, let's do it.
Okay, wonderful. So we probably back in a few weeks to chat about that.
What about Panama's shilling?
Oh, no. Well,
wow.
I felt like he didn't really deserve a shill. But,
I jumped the gun.
Go on then, sir.
Well, not too much to shill. Check out my channel. Tip me a cup of tea on Ko-fi, and I'll have a lot more. This is going to be a very big year for me. I have many things all coming out in a big cluster in the summer or in the later summer. Imagine if Alexander Adams is like the sort of steady marksman, with like firing his shots and everything. I have a shotgun and I'm just going to blast pellets into the wall.
Blast us with culture.
Yes, everything's coming out at once. Everything. The book of philosophy, the authentic reactionary, a book of ballads, rip roaring poems will be coming out as well, and a novel, and probably other things too by that time, because I'm on an upswing at the moment. So things are progressing very well. There'll be more coming. Watch this space.
Wonderful. And if you haven't done it already, please, just like the tank, which is about to smash down, what you can't see in that picture is below the picture is a like button and a subscribe button, and the tank is coming down. Orpan's tank will smashing that like button, and just in the same way, can you please now destroy it?
Yeah. Shell that like button, bayonet that like button, take off your pickle halber and spike that like button.
I saw
hyperinflate that like button. Yeah.
I really want like a reenactment group to try and like show what the hand-to-hand combat with the pickle halber would be. So,
honestly, at this point, I don't think that they had any military value. It was just Prussians being Prussians and wanting a big spike on a helmet, because why not?
Yeah, it's a good look. It's a great look. Okay, let's leave it on that note. Let us all say good night.
Bye, everybody. Oh.
Oh dear.
He's done it again.
He's done it again. Oh no.
Well,
he's coming back though.
Now.
He's coming back.
Yeah. Wait for it.
Yeah.